Yes. Mr. Dahlbeck.
Present.
Mr. Husnick.
Here.
Mr. Munson.
Here.
Mr. Schmidt is here. Mr. Steeler.
Yes, present.
We're all here. Thank you.
Okay, are there any changes to last meeting's minutes? And if not, is there a motion to approve the minutes?
I'd make a motion that we approve the minutes as presented.
Commissioner Husnick has made a motion to approve. Is there a second?
I will second it.
Mr. Dahlbeck seconds. All in favor? Aye?
Aye.
Aye.
And they are approved. Next on the agenda, Mr. Silas Parmar is here from Bolton and Nick.
Well, thanks for having me. I know it's been a couple months, and in that time, we've been waiting for MnDOT to kind of release their list of funded projects for state fiscal year 20, which just began here on July 1st. And I was told the list would be published on Monday on their website, and unfortunately, it still hasn't. So, as you guys recall, earlier in the year, we started taking a look at 3 particular projects for state fiscal year 20. So that's July 1, 2019 through June 30th, 2020. Based on the Commission's recommendations here, Mr. Undum sent an email to MnDOT saying these were the priority of projects that City of Forest Lake would like to receive funding for, starting with the east taxi lanes and then the pavement maintenance, and then the master plan and ALP at the last part of it. What I've heard unofficially is that the only one of those projects that MnDOT has secured funding for is the pavement maintenance project, so the crack repair and seal coat on the runway, taxiway, and the taxi lanes at the airport there. Also, what I've heard is in regards to the kind of the east taxi lane construction project to develop those 9 additional lots, the about $500,000 ask is a pretty big chunk for MnDOT Aeronautics to provide one airport for something that's not a runway or a taxiway project. What they have said is there any way to split that project over a course of 2 years? So that's something that I'll start looking at once they actually release the official list of funded projects. And Mr. Undum has sent an email, I think in February, to try to get a meeting with MnDOT and any members of the commission that want to attend to kind of have a discussion about the capital improvement program for the airport and to kind of hear directly from the source of funding, what their thoughts are on your guys' proposed projects. And then that way allows you guys an opportunity to kind of pivot if there's some other projects you want to move up or down, or at least you hear from MnDOT what their thoughts are. So it seems, though, likely the pavement maintenance project is one that funding will be made available, but unfortunately the east taxi lane or the master plan update would have to wait at least another year. So I'll stop there if anyone has questions.
You say you have a meeting scheduled?
No, what I said is I will schedule a meeting with them once the state funded projects list is released.
Okay.
Mr. Undum has been trying to get a meeting with MnDOT, but they've hesitated, and I think they're waiting for the list to be released so a more elaborate discussion can be held about the airport.
Anybody else have anything?
Where did they had a little bit extra money in for the 2019 fiscal year. Did that ever get spent or sent off to any?
Yeah, that went pretty quickly.
Yeah.
What it was a situation where they had, I don't know the exact amount, but the state had excess money in their 2019 budget where they just said if anyone's ready for a project, they'd give you a grant for it regardless of what the scoring was for that project. So, but the unfortunate part about that is you have to be project ready to take advantage of those funds. So most of it went more towards maintenance projects, anything with fuel facilities, things like that, where you could quite easily solicit quotes and do things of that nature.
But in terms of like master plan and ALP update, why wouldn't we be ready to submit that?
Yeah, that was, I posed the question to Dan Berner, and the response was no, funding was not available for that. But that's a good point.
At least we asked.
Yeah, we tried, yeah.
Gotta get a foot in the door.
So I've been saying this for every month since February, but I'm hopeful now in August we'll have the list ready in hand, and then we can move forward with the commission here about the pavement maintenance project, out there at the airport.
You said scoring. Is their scoring criteria a matter of public record that we can see what their scoring criteria is and possibly tailor our spending to be favorable in that scoring criteria?
I've heard how they score it, but it's nothing that's official. They look at safety improvements, score the highest, and then they go and higher priority from runways to taxiways to aprons, and then taxi lanes, and then anything else kind of falls into, one large category. So they look at, expansion of taxi lanes as lower priority, but the reason why they had funding available for your runway and taxi lane pavement maintenance is because they believe pavement maintenance is something they should invest in because they made a substantial investment in paving the runway and taxiway. It's a great question to pose if we are able to get a meeting with MnDOT to see if they have scoring assignments for their projects.
And I assume the funding that other airports in the metro receive are available to us to see just on a comparative basis if Lake Elmo's getting so much for, taxiways or runways or whatever, and South St. Paul's getting so much, we have something else to look at.
Correct. The list
Yeah.
that's released is for all the airports in the state. So regardless if they receive federal funding or just state only like Forest Lake, you can see where the state funds are being allocated.
If they could count the interest in the city of Forest Lake Airport, we'd be at a high priority.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of interest here at the airport. I mean, we have people sit on a waiting list, for hangars and stuff, I don't know if they think about that or take that into consideration or not.
Well, if they hear it from the commission, it goes a lot further than, your consultant. So that's something why we've been trying to get a CIP meeting with them to express the need for construction of those east taxi lanes. I think Mr. Steeler has mentioned before, he knows 5 people that would build tomorrow if the lots were available. So it's one of those where, everyone here knows the demand is there, but unfortunately, the state's just kind of limited with the funding that they have.
Of course. I was just trying to get a higher priority.
Nope, that's a good way to do it. Well, kind of 1 and 2 kind of roll together. So with that, the CIP is included kind of in the packet there. So MnDOT looks for a 20-year CIP, but this is something that, the commission began working on late in 2018. So there's really no changes that are made on it here as of yet until MnDOT releases their list of funded projects. Then we'll have to look at, so we're in 2020 right now, we'll have to look at what the plan will be for 2021 and with some of the projects that aren't going to receive funding, where to move those, because essentially everything gets shifted a year for projects that don't receive funding. But we can take a harder look at this in the subsequent months, because the next time MnDOT is going to take a snapshot of Forest Lake CIP is until February of 2020. So you have the luxury of the rest of the year to play around with priority projects for state fiscal year 21. But again, if there's anything that comes up that you guys think is worthy of a project, it has to be on your CIP in order to have any shot of receiving state funding. And we can edit this at any time throughout the year. Just keep in mind of when MnDOT actually looks at it, it won't be till February. So that's when you want to have your final version ready to go.
by the end of the year.
And kind of the last thing on my list, Mr. Undum had asked Bolton and Mank previous years and then more recently a couple months ago to take a look at the design for the runway 1331 in regards to the shoulder grading. So the information that we reviewed was the typical section for the construction plans that were made available, and then also the FAA advisory circular in regards to transverse grades on runways. So the analysis for the typical section shown in the plans and meets the FAA design criteria. The FAA states, within your runway safety area, so for runway 1331 at Forest Lake, that's 150 feet wide. You have certain grades on your actual paved surface, and then you also have a maximum shoulder grade for the 37.5 feet on either side of maximum 5%. But then once you get outside of that runway safety area, the FAA allows a 4-to-1 slope, either positive or negative, which appears to be what the runway shoulder grades were designed at for a portion of the runway. So in the packet there, you'll see the typical section that was per the plan, which shows kind of the runway safety area 150 feet wide, but then you'll notice outside of that, you'll see a 4-to-1 slope. And then the last page of your packet is the actual transverse grade design from the FAA advisory circular. And you can see the notes, once you get outside of the runway safety area, it's a 4-to-1 max.
37 and a half feet, and then it's okay to have a 4-to-1 slope.
Correct, because the runway, because you have, the runway width is paved at 75 feet, so then on each side you have a 37 and a half foot shoulder to achieve your 150-foot safety area.
It doesn't have to be 4-to-1, though. It could be less than that.
Correct.
Yeah, 4-to-1's the max.
Yeah.
So this is, we've only reviewed it based on the plan set. We haven't surveyed anything to that effect. I'm not sure if that was done during construction, if the city was taking tabs on it, or the previous consultant, just to ensure the grades were adhered to as designed. But the question was asked whether or not the design met FAA standards, which it does.
I know there's been some concern about that, and so. So the real question is whether or not it was built to that standard,
Correct.
you know, without actually double checking it.
And that's all I had. If there's any other questions, I'd be happy to.
What would it take to do a check of that in just one or two locations along the runway?
Just
Someone out there with
Just a
level
GPS,
and, an
well-
hour's worth of work or so, and they could confirm that it meets or does not meet.
well, I wouldn't recommend a level. That's old school.
Well,
But
yeah.
with nowadays, everything is
Everything's
everything's
When I
GPS.
went to school,
Yeah.
yeah, shot it in with a transit.
And what's wrong with old school, by the way?
Yeah.
Old school takes a lot more time and effort than, I can talk with Mr. Goodman, city engineer, and see if he's got any survey work going in town. Essentially, if we have a number of survey around town here, all it would take is getting a GPS rover set up and just taking cross sections,
I'm sure
along the
we could
way.
Find someone to point out one or two locations that are considered worst case and to make it, save them time, and
Yep.
just check those spots. And if those are within specifications, then they're within specifications.
Yeah, I'll pass the word along
I think it'd be
to,
worth taking a couple spot checks, and Mr. Husnick can probably help point out those locations.
sure.
I think that'd be worth doing.
Once I know some dates that work, I'll pass them along to Mr. Undum and then see if those work for anyone on the commission who's out. I know some of you guys are probably already out there at the airport, so we'll try to pick a day that works best for everyone.
Mr. Shipp has a question on that.
Well, this is a question that I raised, and I appreciate you addressing it, and you're helping me understand it further. And one of the discrepancies was an engineer at MnDOT saying it was actually out of spec, but having Silas explain it, it makes sense to me, and I believe it is 4-to-1. I think that's exactly what MnDOT said it actually is. My concern is liability for the city and safety, of course. But maybe before you get away, the other thing that we've had problems with is between the taxiway and the runway, and we all know it's been really wet, and drain tile was deleted. And I'm trying to understand this whole concept of advisory circulars and what their gravity really is. They're not regulatory, as I understand it, but as it relates to water mitigation, it's actually wildlife mitigation. And as I've been reading, water is supposed to drain within 48 hours, and now the runway was actually paved in 2016. We're seeing it improve as it relates to drainage, which is a very good thing. That's exactly what the contractor possibly predicted. As the soil becomes unpacted over the years, then it drains into the soil better. So that's happening. I'd like to also appreciate the city's effort in mowing that as quickly as possible, getting it down short, because there are times where the grass has gotten so long, you actually have deer bedding down in that area. And of course, that's a tremendous mass that potentially run an aircraft into. So it is improving, but maybe you could speak to that. The whole design is a little bit unorthodox, but here we are living with it. And again, it's safety and potential liability for the city if it's actually out of specifications. And I'm not saying it is, it's just a little bit unorthodox.
Well, when we came aboard as Bolton and Mank, the one thing we knew was that the Rice Creek Watershed District was not releasing the city from the permit because areas were not drying within 48 hours. So one of the first projects that we did explore was installing drain tile through that infield area between the runway and taxiway. We took it to MnDOT, and MnDOT rejected the cost for the project. They stated should have been something that was included in the original project. So that's where it kind of sits. So it is on the CIP for state fiscal year 2021 for infield drainage improvements, but that's about the extent of where it's been. Since that time, the Rice Creek Watershed District has signed off on the construction stormwater permit for the city as areas did start to improve, and that's where things sit currently.
And Mr. Shipp, I don't know if you were here when we were discussing budget items and stuff, and one of the reasons we put master plan and ALP update high on that list is by getting more lessees out there, we can generate more revenue, and the city has an easier time picking up some of these costs, and that's kind of where we want to go. If we can get more hangars out there, we have the people that want to build them, we just got to get the taxiways and the lots ready, and when we can start generating more rent or revenue from lease rents, some of the stuff will be easier to attack, I think.
Yeah, and I agree with you, Don, because the problem with that area that was designed or originally earmarked as being a T-hanger area, there just doesn't seem to be any appetite to put up a T-hanger, either privately or through the city. So that's why it behooves us to really move forward with something where we can get some private hangars in there. It just, it was a tough thing to cash flow from a couple of different private contractors. Me included, I worked on it, some numbers several years ago, and the city, I know, just is not interested in doing that. So we need to take advantage of that area there to get some hangars in there, so.
And I think meeting with MnDOT and kind of communicating that to them, that we have the people waiting to invest and help, our own budget side of things. Otherwise, we're kind of in a catch-22, with things. We've got the land for the hangars, but if we can't
We don't have the infrastructure.
build them, have the infrastructure to build them, then we can't generate those revenues to help fund the things. So it's, anyway, that's, as soon as we get that meeting with MnDOT, that would be great to be able to sit down with them and have that talk and see where they stand on that.
No, fair points. I mean, they recognize the investment they made by paving the runway is going to bring more attention and make Forest Lake Airport more attractive. And now these are, with the commissions in place to kind of go through figuring out, how best to get more aircraft out here.
Mr. Shipp, you had something else?
Well, one point is that as it relates to the operation of the airport, it's certainly about priorities and identification of whether something's really a problem or it isn't, and if it is, then addressing it. Concerning revenue, more revenue to the city is definitely beneficial, of course, within the boundaries of contracts, et cetera, and having a good contract for all, which I would like to speak to. I just want to point out, as it relates to T-hangers, for instance, my understanding is that there are no interest loans available to cities over a 20-year period. And all I'm suggesting is that equation should be looked at, perhaps, and some previous comments from previous council members that we don't want to be in the rental business, but it is a possibility. You kind of rent the airport in one form or another, whether you rent the land or actually rent buildings. And it's just an equation that perhaps should be studied before, someone say it's just unworkable. It's just another option. That's all I'm saying.
It has been looked at, even with the zero interest loan. It just wasn't the thing that would cash flow in less than 30 years, and that was the issue with, at least previously, with the city. That's the only thing I can tell you.
I think it's a 20-year loan, interest-free.
Yep.
I'm operating from memory.
And I don't recall the specifics of it, but I do know the past work that I've been heard of is echoes what Sam says, that it was tough. We couldn't get the cash flow to go positive. We always were operating based on the rents that we could charge monthly, within the market, that we just couldn't justify the expense. But that being said, those numbers have not been updated you know,
For a long time.
for a
right.
while. I don't know when that last analysis was done. I'm just, you know, some of that's been, you know, kind of communicated to me in the past.
Silas, did you have anything else?
No, that was all. Thank you.
All right, thanks.
Thanks, Silas.
Mr. Undum, you are next with progress on farmland and the grass mowing areas.
So I actually have another item too. I have a presentation I can go through in a minute. It kind of along with the budget item, you know, just kind of looking at 20's budget and then some cash flow projections out 10 years, what you see copies of out the dais. On the farmland perspective, I did meet with Chris Taylor out there, you know, before the last meeting, and, you know, we had a conversation about where we could access, you know, for that additional, I think it was 8 to 10 acres to look at. He said this year he would be able to get in, you know, had a kind of a temporary way to access in there. Haven't followed up with him since then because he was kind of in a, you know, the last time I met with him was in a good spot with it. The mowing side, again, just kind of want to do a check-in because since we are doing the reduced mowing out there, I know from Public Works perspective, they are saving quite a bit of labor time, not mowing that entire section. Just want to make sure that, you know, I know I did communicate back to Public Works that there was a request to do a little bit additional in front of, I think, the taxiway, just to kind of square that off, and I did communicate that over there, so just kind of want to do a check-in just to make sure that the area is meeting expectation, that there's no, you know, issues at this point with what's being mowed.
I don't know.
Looked fine with me, but yeah.
I didn't see, they were out there the other day mowing, within 2 days ago, they were out there mowing, but I didn't see if they mowed that extra stretch, you know,
No,
along.
they haven't mowed that extra stretch.
Okay.
And then the other thing, was Taylor gonna cut that?
The additional out there, I did let him know he could cut that, I'll confirm with him that he can.
Yeah, because he's out there cutting the rest area now, so he might as well cut that too.
I'll let him know.
You went over this real quickly. You said he had a conversation where he could access 8 to 10 acres. He has a temporary way to access it this year. So we still need a way to access it next year, or that still needs to get cut down there? What?
If that area is to be permanently accessible, there needs to be an adjustment. The recommended, his first solution was to drive down the runway, which I kind of said, let's try to find an alternative pathway to get in there. We also take a look at what's the cost of actually doing the access point versus what the revenue you're going to get from that 8 to 10 acres. You know, so we got to do that portion of it, but his preferred option of access was to go down the runway, and there's kind of an existing, you know, access point off one of the runway pieces, and I kind of said, it's like a break in
It's,
the,
yeah, it's
in the
off the
drainage.
taxiway there.
Yeah,
It's off the taxiway, not the
sorry,
run. Okay,
taxiway, sorry.
there we go.
I got the
Okay,
terminology messed
now it's making more sense.
Taxiway, excuse me, apologize for that. But no, that was his preferred method of approach, and I did kind of caution him, saying it's probably not, you know, we don't necessarily want tractors driving down the taxiway if we can avoid it. So still looking at the permanent solution, but he said for this year he had a way to get in from the backside of it that he can't guarantee will be there moving forward. So we will need to develop the permanent solution if, again, but that permanent solution needs to be done in a way where it's not costing more money than we'll bring in, you know, based on what we need to do. Because there is quite a bit, when I was out there on ground, there's quite a bit of trees that would need to come down to get the, it's not just a small, I mean, it's a fair chunk of trees that need to come down to get from where he needs to go.
I would imagine probably need about a 40-foot wide swath through there.
Correct, yeah, and it's a little bit longer of an, you know, when he explained to me at first, he just said it was a small, and I went out there, and once you get on the ground, it's, you know.
Can you put it up on the screen so we can see where it is? I mean, it's by Hangar Echo,
Yeah,
Correct.
those trees.
Yeah, it's in the corner of the property, just to kind of right adjacent to the farmland, adjacent on the backside there.
I don't want to waste your time.
The new taxiway and the ditch are kind of took up that area where we would normally get in there, so that was the issue with it.
And he said that even on that, there would be some, if there's a fuel halfway through the tax, there's a break in there, but even that would need to be improved so he could get his equipment across there. And, you know, the number of trips that he needs to make per season out there is, you know, once to cut, you know, well, he would also need to then rake it and then collect, so there's a minimum of 3 plus number of cuts he does, so do the math out, that the equipment would be there a number of times throughout the season, which is why we try to direct him towards a different approach to it versus that. But I did ask him, I said, what's your preferred method? And he said that was the simplest. And I said, well, obviously you're going down a paved access road.
You said catch 22 earlier. It's the same type of situation here. We'd love to get access through those trees. can't do it with volunteer labor, so we have to do it with city labor. But the cost of it might be so much that it wouldn't be worth,
Well,
getting
No,
access to
yeah,
it. So it's
exactly.
6 to 1 and a half dozen to the other.
And then before, I have not gotten a bid for that work yet at this point. I had not actually met with an individual, from a tree removal contractor to see how long that would take.
So it would take a contractor. We can't do it with city staff.
Possibly I'd have to confirm with Dave on that one. I have to reach back out to him on that. But again, this year, the pressure kind of came off when he said he had access points to it. So it's still in the hopper, just has not been finalized at this point.
okay. Do you want to go over this one?
Yep, I can go over that. So I kind of just have a presentation that I've been working on. So if you don't mind just kind of going through this. This kind of ties in kind of exactly what we've been talking about, just where, where does the airport fund look like, today, and what is it going to look like in 10 years based on, the reality of it is there's some pretty significant maintenance expenses that are on the horizon that, we need to start accounting for now versus 10 years down the road when we're trying to play catch up. It's better to do that planning now. So what I ended up doing was developing some cash flow models for the airport. And like I said before, one of the reasons why we're developing the models is to account for those significant maintenance increases or expenses that are on the horizon and try to avoid those future funding gaps. And in essence, trying to avoid a situation like you see on your screen in front of you there. That's actually the airport runway at Silver Bay where there was not the maintenance performed down there that needed to be done. So the airport runway degraded to a point like this. So we're just trying to avoid that from happening, making sure that we're taking care of the asset. Also wanted to give the Airport Commission just a quick budget primer on how the airport fund currently works. So all airport revenues that are collected, from airport generated activities do stay within the airport fund, which is separate from the general fund. No monies that are airport related go into the general fund unless they're specifically directed and transferred into the general fund. So in essence, what that means is that if you have a year where revenues are in excess of expenses and there's money left over at the end of the year, that stays in the airport fund for future expenses. Conversely, if your expenses are in excess of revenue, so you have a year where your expenses are more, that fund balance does get drawn down. When you look at a fund balance, what's the minimum balance that the state auditor recommends? They do recommend 55% of the next year's expenses be kept in the fund as fund balance. Reason being is at the first of the year, the airport fund does not get all the revenues for the upcoming year, especially in a situation like the airport is where most of the lease revenues come in mid-year. We need to make sure that we have cash on hand to pay for those first 6 months worth of expenses before a lot of those revenues come in and are realized. When you look back, on average, the leaseholders combined contribute approximately $33,000 a year to operations. And looking at what the city contributes, and this is through the ag lease revenue that we contribute, that's dedicated into the fund is approximately $21,000 a year. Again, some minor fluctuations that'll happen in there just based on amount of acreage that we actually have being in the ag lease, bucket. And then also addition, that's not like a hard cost, but we also do, the city does not fully charge the airport fund for all of the staff time and maintenance, equipment that's used at the airport. When you look back, the estimated kind of city contribution at that point is estimated right around $15,000 a year. If you look at, the accounting services that we do, some administrative costs that we, don't charge back, and then some of the maintenance or equipment use that takes place at the airport that we're not fully realizing. So the city approximately contributes about $36,000 annually to the airport fund through those two activities. And then just finally, there's, when I look back at some of the previous meeting conversations, there was a little bit of confusion on how the airport operations grant had functions. The way that grant actually operates for the ongoing operations of the airport, that's not just money that we get at the beginning of the year that just sits in our on the revenue side. It's a reimbursement, so we get reimbursed 75% of the activity up to that $18,500 that we get authorized for. So when you look at that, it kind of simplify it down. If we have $10,000 worth of eligible expenses, we get reimbursed from MnDOT for $7,500. So we still have a direct offset to those revenues that come in. In years that we don't make, and we've always had no problem getting to that cap of what we're eligible for, but in years if we did not have maintenance expenses that were grant eligible, we would not get that. We don't get the full amount then. We just get a reduced amount. So I think in the past, the perception was we just get the additional money from MnDOT that goes into our, on our revenue side. We don't do that. That actually has to be offset by an actual reimbursable cost. To kind of taking those numbers, and looking at where we are for 2020 and kind of looking forward on that. These are very preliminary at this point. We're still kind of going through and kind of crunching the numbers, but looking at the preliminary numbers, you're seeing total expenses for 2020 right around $118,000. I mean, again, by the time we final this out, those could change slightly. Just for reference, 2019 expenses were 117. So we see about the same year over year in terms of expenses. One thing that we did budget for this year in 2020 that's in the budget is the $17,500 that's required for the local share of the pavement management grant that we anticipate MnDOT funding. So we have the local share already budgeted in the 2020 operations. However, I wanted to state that the 2020 budget at this point does not have money set aside for future CIP program costs. So we just basically have 2020's expenses budgeted, but the future ones have not been accounted for in 2020. On the revenue side, we're looking at revenues, a little bit of an increase this year. We're looking at revenues at approximately $120,000. For reference, last year's revenues were anticipated at $117,000. One of the reasons for the slight increase is that looking at kind of our leases that we have on the Forest Land Nurseries and the egg lease, I see there's some potential for a slight increase in what we may see on a couple of those leases that come back, and then additional, potential a little bit of increase in terms of the amount of fuel that's sold at the airport. So slight increase in revenues, but again, staying pretty static overall year over year. So you put those together, you have revenues of $120,000, expenses of about $118,000. So you're actually looking at, from an operations standpoint, you're covering the operations cost at the airport, and end of the year, you're basically covering those costs is about $1,800 if everything comes in according to what's being projected here. So kind of taking that 2020 budget and then projecting out what that's going to look like over the next 10 years, considering, like I mentioned before, we have some pretty significant capital expenses coming on. I took and developed a 10-year cash flow model. Now the CIP plan I use for this, I know we've talked about in the past kind of those improvement options to the airport, doing the expansion projects, doing, the ALP. I looked at this as more, let's address this from a strictly lights on, bare minimum what we have to do from a maintenance perspective to maintain the new runway at the airport. So that's what you see here on the screen, is that you see all the projects that when I met with Bolton Mink last year, I said project out what are the maintenance activities that are required for the airport and give me cost estimates for those airport for the next 20 years, which is basically the life of the runway. You see those here on your screen. The one addition that is in here is a fuel pump replacement. Anticipated over the next 20 years, that fuel pump at the airport is probably going to need to be replaced. So we are going to start addressing that in terms of the CIP plan. This model that's here also assumes that MnDOT continues along on the 90-10 funding structure. So that assumes there's no change in what MnDOT is funding these local maintenance activities at. So if they go back to an 80-20, this model kind of would need to be reworked to account for that difference in local share. But I'm anticipating 90-10 funding going on for the next 20 years. If you look closely, the fuel pump replacement, the city share is a little bit higher than 90-10. That's because MnDOT views those projects with a different funding mechanism. So I did account for that when I did model this out. So what I did is I took out, looked at this, and if you look at here on the bottom of the screen, you'll see that the annual CIP contribution for us to make these obligations, we need to start putting $20,000 away into a CIP fund to fund these maintenance expenses moving forward. So I took that $20,000 a year and just wanted to make sure that if we put those away on an annual basis, that we're going to be able to cover all the maintenance expenses without having to go, in the red at any point. And you see here on your screen is this is what the CIP fund balance would look like funded at $20,000 a year. Anytime you see a decrease, that's when a project is actually going to take place. The big project is the full reclamation, which happens out here in 2038. That's the $200,000 city match that's required for the full reclamation project at the airport. That is the one that would actually draw the airport fund down pretty significantly. When I modeled it out at 20,000, you actually see it going a little bit negative out here, but at 20 years down the road, it's just going slightly negative. I think that's not really anything to get too much heartburn over, but just wanted to be aware that, even with $20,000 a year, you do go in the red based on current projections. So I took kind of that CIP plan for the next 20 years and what we need to put away for that, and then look at what the current fund balance is, and then develop the cash flow model for the airport fund. Some of the assumptions that I used when I developed the model was adjusting revenues in even years for leaseholder for the lease payments. I did a 2% CPI assumption, which is based on the current lease language that's out at the airport. So every other year adjusting, and I use an average of 2% for the CPI. The egg lease revenues, I actually projected those out as stable. I will kind of want to caveat this with the fact that there's potentially some volatility here with, you don't know what the commodities market's going to be, which right now, egg prices for egg leased land is actually being pushed. There's a downward pressure on that pricing model. Also, if some of that land that's currently under egg lease ever were to be sold or as in developed, you have the potential for some of that land, that revenue stream to be, you know, reduced. But kind of given the fact that's going to be really tough to predict if and when that falls off, I projected it out as stable, you know, for this 10-year model that's here. Also, adjusted expenses 2% annually, so you see a 2% increase in what the expenses are for the airport, and then factored in that $20,000 annual CPI or CIP contribution starting in 2021. And then I developed two models. I wanted one where I looked at what are the true costs of the airport. So if the city, you know, if the city started charging back for the full time that we spent down there, what does the airport fund look like on that model? And the city continues on as we have in the past where we're not charging back true costs. Wanted to see what that model looked like as well. So that's the reason for the differences that are in there. And you see on the spreadsheet, you have the full spreadsheet at the dais, and there's copies over here on the table as well. But I wanted to draw your attention here between the difference between the operating expense from 2020 and 2021. So you actually will see a decrease in operating expenses in 2021. The reason for that is that you no longer have that $17,000 that's required for this year's pavement management project. That doesn't need to be budgeted next year. That's a one-time expense. That expense will clear the books this year. So we actually are going to see a decrease in operating expenses next year. However, in 2021, that's when the CIP, you'll see that CIP investment line item be added in, and then you have the wage chargeback here. So just wanted to kind of show that's the reason why, you know, these numbers are where they are. I just wanted to, again, full disclosure as to how I came up with that base. And that 2% annual increase will then be based on that 106. So that's where the revenues start to go up. And that 2% is based on an estimated CPI increase. So when we look at a 10-year cash flow model based on true costs, you have us starting out with the current fund balance here on the left at 160. The red line that goes across the middle of the screen, that is the fund balance minimum. That's 55%. That's the minimum required. So you see here on the true cost model, you have at 2023, we're starting to dip below what's the recommended fund balance. And then about midway through 2026, the airport fund, based on the cash flows that are here, actually goes and turns into negative. So the cash that's on hand right now is going to be exhausted in 2026. It's a little bit better if the city continues on, does the true cost assessment, if we still are able to supplement wages moving forward. You see that true cost line here, again, represented in red. The fund balance it's still in decline, but it's a little bit less of a decline. We don't actually hit that threshold here until 2028. And in 2030, there's still cash available in the airport fund. It's just right around 20,000. So there's still, overall, you're still seeing a decline, but you're just seeing a little bit less of a decline on the if the wages are supplemented. I also looked at it, there's been some conversation of, can we just get rid of the fund balance owed, the $280 flat fee. So I ran back and I said, let's look at what the remaining balance is on the payment fund and take a look at what would happen if we took current cash fund balances and paid that remaining balance off. And it reran the models looking at that. Here you go. This is the model where it's, again, the true cost of operations. You see here the yellow line is if the $280 balance is eliminated using the current cash flow balance. And the blue line is the one that I presented earlier, which is the true cost of operations using the existing fund balance of 160. Here you see the fund, since it starts at a lower point, it hits that basically that zero rate in 2023. So it's about 3 years worth of cash left on hand, if we eliminate that $280, the $70,000 balance. This year, on the supplemented wages, while it still goes negative, it just goes out to 2028. We are able to stay above the minimum, that minimum fund balance requirement out here to about 23.5, but midway through there is when we start to dip below. So again, both projections still have us going in, a projection where over the course of the next 10 years, there's going to be a deficit within the fund. So then I looked at, is there a way that we can potentially restructure how we fund these maintenance activities to kind of potentially get us a better, to make these numbers, to develop a different cash flow model. So instead of doing a 20-year payment plan, I looked at it, can we do it over 15 years versus 20 years, and what's the impact of fund balance if we do it using that model? Same assumptions are made. The only change is that the 2023 project will be paid out of cash and not under the CIP, because that would be done within the current operations. So that should move. It's a relatively small project, so it takes the amount from 400,000 down to 397. Annual contribution from the CIP that's required goes up to $26,000 a year. All the other assumptions stay the same. Here's your fund balance projection over the 15-year plan. What I did do is to kind of potentially prime the pump on this one and get just a line item within the airport operations budget. I do have from 2020 to 2025, or 2024, excuse me, $5,000 just being allocated just to kind of start that fund balance, start to build up a little bit of cash reserve. And then here you see this projection actually stays positive the entire time. This is actually not dipping to so this $26,000 starting in 2025 actually keeps the fund balance for CIP positive over the course of the next 20 years. What this actually does here on the 15-year plan, true cost of operations, here you see the fund balance actually stays relatively flat for the next 4 years before that decline starts to hit. Bear in mind, though, we're not fully contributing the amount that's required to fund those operational costs until 2025. So that's where that first major drop happens there. But for the next 5 years, we are seeing fund balance stay in a relatively healthy state. Here we actually see, again, if the city supplements the wages that do the full cost chargebacks, you actually see a slight increase in fund balance. So there'll be a little bit of an increase in fund balance before that drop hits. One thing I also would want to mention at this point as well, over the next 5 years, there could be some small adjustments to revenues and expenses. I mean, we're going to have a better cost. We're relatively early on into a full build-out scenario. We have had the past 3 years, from a look-back perspective, there's been a lot of one-time costs that have been hit on the budget with the airport construction. So some of those expenses have been a little bit out of whack. So a 5-year kind of grace period at this point does allow for us to get a little bit, more accurate picture, so to speak, in terms of what the actual expenses are. That being said, that would also be predicated on the fact that we're not doing a major, a lot more build-out activity on there and incurring a lot of one-time costs. But here again, you see a little bit, to summarize this, you see a little bit of increase. This one actually presents the healthiest fund balance model because you stay above the minimum fund balance requirement through all the way out to 2029. At 2030, though, you do dip below. Again, want everybody to be aware, if I were to take this 10-year model and bring it up to 20 years, the next 10 years outside this window, this line just continues to decrease because, again, you're not truly covering the cost of operations with that CIP holdback that needs to be accounted for. Again, eliminated the $280 flat fee requirement on this one. Here you see fund balance here. It stays above the minimum operation line until that CIP fully is realized in the budget, and then the downward slide happens here. And the supplemental wage, you see a little bit of fund balance increase before we start to go on the downward projection. The key takeaways from developing this model, I think it needs to be said that we, looking long-term, we need to figure out a way to either cut expenses at the airport or increase revenues. That's just, plain and simple. I can't say it any clearer than that. If we're going to fully fund these maintenance activities that are there, all of the cash flow scenarios that were developed show the airport either insolvent or nearing insolvency within the next 10 years. When you factor in that CIP holdback, that needs to be, at least accounted for if you're going to maintain the paved runway. The elimination of the $280, taking that fund balance and using current fund balance to take away that paving deficit, expedites the insolvency. And if you're looking at all the models that were presented, if you're going to pick one that presents the healthiest fund balance, is using the 15-year CIP payback with the city continuing to supplement wages and equipment. just kind of want, we've talked in the last year quite a bit about kind of other projects, and I just kind of wanted to show some modeling at this point to kind of show that, that paved runway, there is significant maintenance expenses, and I just want the airport commission to be aware that those are on the horizon, and, we need to start budgeting for that, making sure that the future budgets are able to account for those expenses, because even though MnDOT will, participate 90%, we still need to come up with a local share. So just trying to come up with that local share. So I know I've kind of dumped a lot of information on you at this point, and happy to answer any questions, initial comments on it, thoughts. If you think I may have missed something, they're happy to hear any information, comments on that at this point.
A couple of assumptions that you're making, and we've talked about this before, Dan, is that we're kind of completely on our own here. You know what I mean? And when you talk about the ag leases, and those are volatile, no question about it, and we're going to lose a big portion of that. No matter what we do in the city of Forest Lake, there's an economic impact that goes with it. I don't care if it's parks and trails, baseball fields, whatever, and the airport's no different. And so when that revenue starts to go away, when that property is being sold, and I'm talking about the 117 acres of buildable land south of the airport that we collect revenue off of right now. As that goes away, there has to be some communication, at least with the city and the city fathers, that say, look, this has been a benefit to the city of Forest Lake all along. And when those parcels are being sold, there has to be some compensation or something that's going to help the airport, because that revenue is going to go away.
I mean, it seems like basic accounting. You have a balance sheet and you have an income statement. The land is an asset on the balance sheet. And if you're
Right.
selling off that land, the dollars still stay. And that hasn't happened in the past. When the land has been sold off from the airport land that was originally given, that money has not come back to the airport. And when you mentioned it again now, that revenue will decrease when that land's sold off, I have to say, well, wait a minute, where's the money of the sale of that land going? That should come right to the airport, as well as the previous land that was sold off.
When I say revenues decrease, what I mean to say is that you have an annual revenue stream that you can, at this point, you have.
I understand that.
And that's, and I'm fully cognizant of what you mentioned there, and that is, as that land, and that's why I didn't try to project out at what point that land's gonna sell, because it's really tough to know with this crystal ball saying, in 2028, that land's gonna sell for X amount, and then we can.
But I think even more importantly than talking about that in the future is let's talk about the past and where we were when the land was granted to the city, and how many acres there were, and how many acres there are now associated with the airport, and the dollars associated with that land that was sold off. Because from my understanding, I don't see how that came back to the airport. That asset was just taken from the airport, and it doesn't. And now the airport's on their own to support themselves, and it just doesn't make accounting sense.
Well, and for a point of clarification on that, there is, the revenue streams that, come in for the ag lease are dedicated back to the airport.
No, I understand.
So, there is some, the reason why I say that is that, there could be a motion that gets that gets carved somewhere else. The city has committed those funds. Since we're doing ag lease revenue there and at the Forest Lake Nursery, that does come in as a revenue stream.
No, I get that. And we can go on and on about that, and I'm sure it'll be talked about more. But I wanted to also state on that, we get back to the whole catch-22 thing of we have space to build 9 hangars immediately. With the engineering involved to do that portion of it's minimal, and then we have the whole area down by Hangar Echo can be developed. I don't know how many hangars you could put down there, but between the 9 up at the south end and that land down there, probably another 30 hangars. And you're talking another $33,000 a year on the revenue side in this sheet that is never accounted for in any of this analysis looking out 30 years. I got to believe that it's reasonable to assume that these hangars will be built out.
And the reason why I did not put in build-out expenses in there, because where's the cash gonna come, let's assume MnDOT, I mean, granted, we've talked about in the past that a build out happens, MnDOT says 90-10 funding on it, so that cost is there that the new hangar owners will come in as, is done in the past, they pay the, infrastructure fees that were there. So in essence, it's a cash neutral. However, that needs to be fronted from somewhere. And what I'm trying to show here is that, while that's a possibility, there's not a cash reserve that's there to basically existing front that investment.
See, the sad part about the whole thing is when we decided to pave the runway, and I want to go back a ways because this goes back to 2008 really, or even before. We had already gotten, back then, MnDOT would have paid or participated at an 80% 20 partnership. And we had already gotten the go-ahead to do that on one, with a different council at that time. And then all of a sudden, MnDOT couldn't do it because there was some problem with their cash flow. Well, then it sat around for quite some time, and then all of a sudden, MnDOT says, well, you know what? We can fund this project for 90%. Now we can save the city $300,000 by doing that. And that wasn't good enough for the council. And so then that's where we ended up with this, where it wasn't fully funded, that $300,000 was not fully funded when it should have been. And one of the, so that's really been a sore spot during the whole process. The other thing that, and I'm not picking on you, Dan, because I appreciate all your hard work. But the other part that never ever gets factored into this is the impact that we've made with the developments in and around that, what used to be airport property and what's actually happened on the airport. With the new hangars, they all pay taxes, both into the school and the city and county and all that. None of those things are ever factored into this economic impact that the airport has. And so I really would like to make sure that, or at least see the city realize that, and so that we can move forward and because as this ag revenue, if that's what we're counting on, that's just not going to hack it. It just isn't going to work. And I agree completely with you, Don, with the statements you've made. I don't know what the tax implications are with the new houses that are already there that used to be airport property. It's horrendous. I mean, there's a lot of value there. And so the other thing too that never gets figured into this equation is the equipment that MnDOT has participated in that the city uses elsewhere, and so it's been a benefit to the city to have that. It's been in the $90,000 to $100,000 range, and so that to me takes up some of that expense that the city should recognize. And so if we can get this to council, that we need to make sure that that happens. So that's all I have right now.
Any of the other commissioners want to, Mr. Schmidt?
Got a couple of comments. This is a tremendous amount of work that you did. I really appreciate it. I don't even want to ask how many hours you spent on it. Okay. Thank you so much for doing that, number one. Number two, you made these projections with our current hangar situation and our current incomes. Is there a curve somewhere, an intersection point for an ideal number of hangars that would cause those curves, instead of going down, to flatline or even maybe just go up a little bit?
Good point. I did not, I mean.
I don't expect, I knew that you didn't.
I was
and-
trying to develop a baseline, but I had the exact same thought. Is there an ideal spot where, what would 11 hangars do from an annual budget
Right, exactly,
perspective?
or 15, or whatever number it is.
Correct. The issue that I ran into, though, when looking at that, and reality is that, kind of given the uncertainty from MnDOT's cost participation, I also wanted, it'd be different if I had assurances that over the next 2 years, they're going to cost participate on this one.
Yep.
Where it's easier to go in and say, you have a fund balance of $160,000. Yeah, draw down $50,000 because you're going to get it back in 2 years when it builds back out. But I have, the reality is you have known maintenance expenses that we have to account for. So that was the priority. To your point, though, there is probably a sweet spot where you can get the hangar up, because you bring on 11 additional hangars, even when you put a taxi lane in front of it, you're not going to double you're going to see a small increase in what that maintenance expense is going to be, but you also are seeing an increase in revenues. I don't know where that intersection is,
If we meet with MnDOT, that'd be a great number to know.
Correct.
To sit down with MnDOT, hey, we're telling them, we're trying to get ourselves self-sufficient here by doing this. And I would think they would be in favor of that with the investment they've made in our airport. But, I mean, I don't know how tough it would be to find that sweet spot, just a trial and error or whatever. But I think it'd be advantageous to look at it.
I mean, I think the other thing that we need to, keep in the back of our minds too is that, I mean, there is that component of, hangar expansions on the economy too. If you have a significant economic crash, so the fear would be you build when the economy is roaring and everybody's on a list, and then all of a sudden you invest $100,000 worth of capital, and then something happens in the economy and nobody can afford to put hangars on anymore. Now you're further back on a long-term plan. So just trying to kind of keep all of those factors in play at this point. But I mean, if MnDOT says, yeah, we can do infrastructure improvement, we can do Tyson expansion, I mean, that changes the dynamic of this, and you have there probably baked in another $7,000, $8,000 worth of revenue.
The city already did that very same scenario, and it wasn't the airport. And it was that area that's just on the western edge of the airport. They put all that infrastructure in there and then waited years for anything to happen there. And some of it's still sitting there,
And that's, and that's where, if you look at it right now, I mean, it's different if it was, the fund balance. I mean, I took existing fund balances and ran it out, and that's what I tried to start with, and as, if we kind of realize that in 5 years, we gotta start putting some significant capital away for these improvements, we have 5 years to kind of solve these short-term issues. Just want the commission to be aware of, though, as we start talking about expansions, keep these projections just kind of in the back of your mind as we're kind of looking out, saying, I couldn't come up with a scenario that we stayed, unless the CIP requirements were not met. And then you stay flatline, because outside of CIP requirements, operational costs, operational income, you saw in the 5 year, you're flat. It's that CIP requirement that didn't exist prior to the runway being paved. You did not have this big expensive maintenance out there. You had operational maintenance out there. You had, some other small maintenance expenses, but you weren't seeing a looming $400,000 every 20-year expense that needed to be accounted for. So that's why you see this kind of decline and this need to do look for additional revenue streams.
A couple more questions, if you don't mind. If I send you an email requesting a copy of this presentation, would you be able to email it to me? I'll send you an email reminder. Thank you. I'm just going to reiterate what's been said here already. There's direct, there's secondary, and there's tertiary economic benefit to the community for having an airport. I just want to make sure that I'm not worried about you, I'm worried about City Council recognizing that. There's tax income from houses that were built on former airport property. It's important that the council recognizes that. We've gotten equipment from MnDOT, benefited the city. It's important that the council recognizes that. And again, we've had land taken away from the airport without any benefit back to the airport at all. It's important that the council recognizes that. And I'm saying that for the public recorded record more than anything else.
And that land includes ball fields, ice arenas.
All kinds of non-airport things, yes, and it's important that the city recognizes that,
Well,
so.
There's also a benefit from the development stages too, or development planning, because people can look at this and if they have a business or whatever, they may want to build because there is an airport there and that kind of thing. So we have to recognize all those things, and there's so many things that can get in the way with what you just showed us here, Dan. I mean, it was all on assumptions, of course. Great job, don't get me wrong, but I think that I think the whole thing's going to work. I really do. I think it's going to work out. And
One last thing, I appreciate your reference to Silver Bay. I've personally been to Silver Bay Airport, and I've personally talked to the mayor of Silver Bay multiple times on the phone when I found out they were in trouble. And I've also talked to local pilots in Silver Bay area, and I've driven there. I've got photos of it on my phone. That was a little bit of a political hack job too. They purposely did not invest money in the airport for purposes of killing it. And I appreciate the picture, but we're not in danger. I hope we're not in danger of going that extreme. That's all I've got.
I mean, I think this is, the reason why these were all done, like I said before, was just the fact that it's easier to kind of pre-plan for these expenses versus all of a sudden 2037, the airport commission at that time is sitting there going, hey, well, guess what? Next year we have $200,000 that we need to come up with in a year. If we're putting money away, these are things where it's like, I'm glad the airport commission back then started on this pathway to, cash flowing or basically taking care of these expenses, and that's.
Were you directed to make this presentation? I don't remember if we talked about it last week or not. You just
I
spent a
did
lot
it
of
as part
time.
of just the budget projections, because this has been such a kind of I wanted to pour in some clarity behind all of the, let's try this, let's do this, let's cash flow this. I mean, it's one of those things where this at least starts a baseline that now we can kind of work off of and go from there.
This is something that's updatable as true costs come in, and then
Absolutely, yeah.
we can change our projections and.
Yeah, I mean, the model sheets that I have built right now, you can go in there and change it, say we want to take the CIP from 20,000 to 15, you can change that, it changes out everything, and
Yep,
everything
yep,
flows, and
yep.
revenues can be adjusted, and the expenses can be adjusted, so it's all fully workable.
Nice work.
Any other commissioners have any comments or questions for Dan on that? We will go down to others from the floor, if anyone has anything else. I know we have a couple visitors. Mr. Ship Senior, you have something? What do you want? Come up or?
Trying to cash flow against our expenses, and I don't hear anybody come up with, what's this airport worth to the city? You guys have mentioned it now, that all of these different things that have happened because of the airport, but I don't see the airport getting any credit for any of that. We're just sitting, have to cash flow against the expenses, and I don't think that's right.
I hear you, and I think that, Mr. Husnick and I said that in a different way to him, that we shouldn't have to, with what the airport has given directly in terms of land, but like you say, I think what you're referring to is more indirectly in terms of the value it adds to the community. I agree, and I think in the past, and I wasn't here for all the past, but some of it, the past commission did not recognize that as they should have. And I think we have a different, not commission, I'm sorry, city council.
Yep.
I think we have a city council now that I think looks at it in a different light than the past, from my experience with the individuals I know.
We have not had an in-depth conversation about it, but that's exactly what I want to have, and this helps with that conversation. There's no question about it.
Mr. Ship.
I think it's a productive meeting. Thank you all for your service. Mr. Emblem, I think that was very good. Further discussion, it's a partnership. The airport is a public trust. That means partnering as much as possible, transparency, discussion. There are real needs for the city. But you have to deal with certain constants as it relates to that trust. One of my interests is my contract. And the very first airport commission meeting I went to was in March of 2016, where the concept of having leaseholders pay for part of the runway was advanced and it passed. I spoke out against that at that meeting. I wish there had been dramatic contract analysis, cost analysis prior to that time period. I manage my finances. I can help you out. I remember the last vacation I went on. I reel it in, So I have a contract. The city doesn't have a choice. The airport commission doesn't have a choice. The city council doesn't have a choice. They have to respect the contract. But all those rules relating to the operation of the public facility, this transition of the 640 acres from private to public, just tremendous economic benefit. It's very complicated cost and asset liability analysis. There is a path forward. One of the things I would suggest is that municipal airports are governed by state statute section 360. The commission is supposed to have a treasurer. I've advised the commission of this several times. You're in essence acting as the airport commission treasurer, but amongst this group, it's very clear in the state statutes, one of these members from the founding, very first meeting of the airport commission is supposed to be an appointed treasurer. And I think it's a reasonable expectation that you don't keep the books, you actually work hand in hand with the city. In this case, you're doing this analysis in depth, but this very transparent process so that everybody can get on common ground, so it's a workable thing for everybody. The future variables relating to costs, they're uncertain. My personal anecdote is my financial advisor advised me not to build So they're gonna go after you. They're gonna get in a cash crunch, they're gonna go after you. I built anyway, paid all my bills, but I expect my contract to be respected. It's as simple as that. But follow all the rules as it relates to this public facility, and let's try to achieve common ground and move forward. The skydivers, we should be courting the skydivers to come back. They bought $50,000 worth of fuel every year, just as one example, as a revenue stream. Mr. Dunham, I'm going to backtrack a little bit as it related to the local farmer, hay mower, going across the taxiway. All I want to suggest is that all kinds of different airport vehicles operate all over airports, all over the country, all the time, whether it's a taxiway or the runway. And probably the biggest thing is who's operating on that particular point. In this case, you're referring to a taxiway. There would be two concerns. One is, does it actually damage the edge by driving a large tractor upon it? That would be one thing to consider. But as it relates to safety, it's a pretty low risk as contrasting that to creating an expensive approach to that area. I think it's a very reasonable risk, even if they had to transit across the runway. Typically, there's some kind of special training course, at least just generally being cognizant that airplanes could be in operation, but the total operations at Forest Lake are much lower than many of the airports, virtually anywhere. So I would just suggest it's a reasonable risk, and you don't really have to fear that from a reasonable perspective. Operate the machinery where it needs to go, and it's a cost savings for the city. So again, that's my piece.
I think the one concern on that might be the weight of the tractors. I know runways and taxiways nationwide, they run them, but I know a more commercial runway has a much more engineered base below than a small runway like this. And maybe Silas can look into what type of vehicle the asphalt out there is intended to be on, and maybe it's certain times of the year, like summer like this, when it's dry, that it's not a big deal. But that is a concern, because we certainly don't want more wear and tear than we already have when our maintenance cost is a big concern. But yeah, I hear you there. In terms of safety, you put flashing lights on top and proper training and those sorts of things. Those can be dealt with. But, yeah. Anything else from anyone? No. Is there a motion to adjourn?
I did notice the grass by Hangar 28 was cut.
Oh, that'd be the next subject, which will only take a minute.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know, did we get an email or a letter out to everybody?
Did not get that yet.
I apologize, I was buried in
Okay.
the cash flow analysis last month, but
Apparently one did get taken care of, but we've had a couple situations where, look, we want this airport to be the best it can be. And, as far as I'm concerned, we all have an obligation to keep the grass mowed, and certainly if you're in the stages where you're just getting the thing going, that's different. But when the grass gets that high, let's do something about it.
Yeah.
And so, like I said before, this is my opinion, and I'm just one vote. Send a letter to everybody. We don't want to single out anybody and say that, there's an obligation under their contract to take care of the grass
Keep
and their
things-
lot.
Yep.
And there's also, and I forgot to bring that piece of paper you gave me, Dan, about, there's also a city ordinance about noxious weeds and grass and that kind of stuff too. And if we have to send a copy of that along with it, great. But there's no reason to be doing what we're doing there.
Just to brainstorm, asking for the city to comment, we're starting to gain some traction with adolescents at the airport. They come out, we give them rides or hang around, they have a genuine interest. One of them happens to mow grass. The city owns the land. If this 13-year-old person put a notice on hangers and volunteered or payment or whatever, that's a private transaction, does the city have any reservations about an adolescent mowing the grass at the land that they own? And maybe that needs further deliberation.
yeah, I'd have to go back just to confirm it, but initial reaction would be,
Yeah, that gets to be kind of a sticky thing, and but we can certainly do.
yeah, I can
Talk about
I
it.
can look into that
There's
more.
a willing party out there, and you can solve both things at one time for
Yeah, so
mutual benefit.
based on that, I'd make a motion that we adjourn.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor? Aye. So moved.
Aye.
So moved. Adjourn. adjourned.